Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, and welcome to Turn the Page. I am Lisa, and I'm here today with Caitlin, and she has a book she would like to talk about. I guess I will just let you get started and introduce yourself and talk about your book a little bit.
Sure. So yeah, my name is Caitlin Barasch. I recently published my first novel. It's called A Novel Obsession. And in, a very short log line, it is about a young aspiring writer in her early 20s who finds out her boyfriend kind of moved to a different country for a woman that works in the same industry as she does. My protagonist, Naomi, is a bookseller. She finds out her boyfriend's ex works as an editor in the literary world. She starts to spiral, obsess over this woman, try to figure out how they are similar, how they are different. And her obsession just completely escalates and becomes a fully fledged friendship under false pretenses. Sort of inserts herself into this woman, Rosemary's life, in all manner of ways, in very unhealthy ways, in very deceptive ways, and all in sort of what she tells herself. Her justification metric is that she's going to write a book about it. So it's essentially about a young writer who is looking for a story to tell and thinks that she's stumbled her way into one, and begins to talk about and write about the people in her life in increasingly dangerous ways, and things sort of go from there and become incredibly wacky.
Wacky is one way to describe it.
Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to mention, because it's a big deal in the library world, that you got a starred review from Booklist and Kirkus. Kirkus is they're not very generous with their star reviews. So that's always a huge deal. And whenever I talk about books, I always like to say, like Kirkus is like, the thing. And also Good Morning America named it a GMA Buzz Pick. So that's very exciting.
It was really lovely. Yeah, I was really surprised. I mean, I feel like I shouldn't say that I was surprised, but I think anytime you get any sort of publicity, it feels like, there's so many books out there. So it's just really, really affirming.
Right. Let me just say, what inspired you to write a book about a girl obsessed with her first real boyfriend? Because I feel like that's something that usually happens. Our first real boyfriend's ex-girlfriend. It doesn't always happen like that. So that's why it's different. It's just a different concept.
Yeah. So I was really interested in not only a story about a young woman who is incredibly sort of aimless in her life and is not only trying to write a book, but is also sort of conflating reality with fiction. Because I think over the course of my journey as a writer, I think I've really been considering these questions of like, how do we accurately portray real life on the page? How do we fictionalize our lives? How do we stay emotionally honest in a way that also lends itself to a fictional plot? And so I think that I naturally was gravitating towards writing about a writer who was trying to find a story to tell, because at the time that I was writing this, I was a writer trying to find a story to tell. And I was increasingly interested in just the ways in which I was relying on social media, the ways that everyone in my life was talking and relating to social media, and how it unfortunately conflates our idea of what the lives other people are living. And we sort of see only a highlight reel. We're consistently, in my opinion, we consistently compare ourselves to other people's lives as they're lived online, and sort of forget that, constructing a profile online is almost the same thing as constructing a narrative of how you would like other people to see you. And I was just incredibly interested in those questions, and it sort of really lended itself well to my character becoming obsessed with her boyfriend's ex via seeing the way that she portrays herself online, and then taking that completely offline and escalating it into a literal stalking scenario where she follows her into bars, she follows her onto trains, and really tries to see what she's all about offline, in a way to sort of also control the image that she's portraying by then writing about it. Because in a sense, I think Naomi, my protagonist, really wants to control everyone and everything around her for a variety of different reasons. And a way for her to do that is to get up close and personal with this woman, and try to find a way to claim some part of her by putting her down on the page as a character. So all of those things were things I was thinking about as I was writing, and tried to sort of explore and interrogate through the book itself.
So how long did it take you to write the book from like start to finish? Did you pick it up and put it back and whatever, or was it just?
It was definitely a process. So I started in the summer of 2016, and which feels like a millennium ago, given everything that we have been through as a society over the past several years. But yeah, so I started in 2016, and technically, if I can say that, you know, part of the process was editing it with my editor post book deal, I didn't finish the book. Like, it wasn't locked and completely finished until March 2021. So about a year ago was when I stopped tinkering with it and had to sort of let the copy editors come in and do their thing. And I wasn't really allowed to change anything after that. So yeah, like, I guess 5 years from start to finish, from the first chapter to the very last little edit and tweak. But definitely, as you sort of suggested, I did put it down and pick it back up again, and put it down and pick it back up again. It was definitely a process. I had never written a novel before. This is actually the first novel I've ever finished, which is crazy. And I feel like maybe the next one will be a little bit easier and might not take as long. Now that I've written one, I hope I can write another. But yeah, I think I had many different versions of this book as well. Like, there was a period of time in 2020 when I was beginning to query agents and reach out to people in the industry to try to see if I could get it published. I had a lot of really positive feedback, but then it was sort of an overwhelming, unanimous feeling from each agent that I spoke to that there was something that wasn't quite working in the second half. And so I had to really go in 2020 and perform like pretty intense surgery on my own book to try to figure out what was going wrong and why agents were losing attention in it, why they were losing interest in it. And that was a really big learning experience for me. I had to sort of kill all my darlings, so to speak, which is a cliche that we probably speak about a lot in the industry, but it feels accurate in so many ways. I had to find sort of a new way back into the story.
I loved all the names that you use, because they're not names that, you know, they're not common names, like Naomi, Rosemary, Khalid, and what was the guy that she used as the fake name who really was a real person?
Oh, Lachlan.
Yes, those are not names that you like hear every day. Were you inspired? Like, did you use like a baby book, or did you know people with these names?
That's a good question too. So I honestly, because I grew up in New York, and I had characters that were both Australian and Welsh. And I literally think I Googled once, like, popular common Welsh names, popular common Australian names, and just decided like what sounded great to me, like what names resonated with me as a character. But I'm glad to hear you say that, because it would be easy to just, name like Jane and John, but I wanted there to be, I also wanted the names to have, at least especially with Rosemary, like her name was sort of the first name I stumbled into, because I wanted a name that, and I think this is like, I'm maybe be quoting myself here, but I wanted a name that had like very sweet associations, a name that most people would believe is beautiful. Everyone believes that the flower rose is beautiful. And I just always thought that name was beautiful. And I wanted Rosemary to be this ideal that Naomi is constantly putting her on a pedestal and believing that she is better or more worthy than Naomi herself. And yeah, I think so. Rosemary was the first name that I really thought about and wanted to mean something.
Yeah, it helps you when you're reading too, if they're like unique names, because then you like remember the characters better. If you have a bunch of like Brian's, Michaels, you're like, oh God, not another person with that name. That actually helps, like as a reader, it helps when they have unique names like that. That's why, it's something that stood out to me. And now that you mentioned the international thing, I also love that he was Welsh and Naomi went to school in Australia. And she went to go visit him in his home. And it was just nice because it's like international. You got away from New York City, you got to see other, places. You got to meet his family. It just seemed like, I just liked it. And I just thought I would say that.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
It's just nice to get out of that area. It's not every day that the characters get up and leave the country. So And I think she also liked his sexy voice because
exactly, fully. I mean, I think a lot of, I think especially because Americans, I think that occasionally we forget that the rest of the world exists. And like, maybe, I hope that's not a controversial statement, but I think, because our country is so big, there's so many places to go within the country. Like there's so many states I've never visited. And similarly, probably with Naomi, but there's something that we exoticize other nationalities and other countries. And I think she was looking for some sort of escapist reality. I think she wasn't happy with her. She's not happy with her situation. She doesn't really have a lot of like tangible reasons to be unhappy, and yet she is. And I think that Caleb, being from a country that she was unfamiliar with, a country that she has romanticized, really was a huge deal for her and allowed him to become, once again, more like a character to her than a real person, which is unfortunate because he is a real person. And their relationship could have been really real and really moving, on page and off. And she sort of diminishes him to a character in a sense, in a what I believe is kind of a tragic way. But yeah, I always wondered, and I think that's why there's a line in the book, like, would either woman have been as obsessed with and attracted to Caleb if he hadn't been, someone different, someone new to both of them?
Right. Kind of exotic.
Yeah, they both romanticized him for sure.
Yeah. And I think what made it interesting is that Caitlin went through her own issues with men in the past. She had that background with the whole thing, like, the jazz
drummer. Yeah. Naomi. Yeah.
And then what happened to her when she was in Australia? Like,
yeah.
So you have there's a party that's like sympathetic towards the whole thing, with everything that went on with Naomi. Like, you're like, well, she had issues, but she also had issues.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Like I never, I wanted Naomi to have like a dark past because, for one, I think when you're thinking about character, you're always thinking about the why behind the behavior. And I didn't want to pathologize her. I didn't want to say, because of this, she did that. Like, it's never that simple, right? It's never as simple as cause and effect. But I think all of her experiences just made her who she is, gave her certain belief systems about herself. And she just used that particular belief system to behave in a really irrational, unhealthy way. Like, she was not helping herself. I don't think she was really self-aware enough. Well, in a sense, I think she's aware the entire time that she's somehow sabotaging herself, but she can't stop. And there's a part of her that gets a thrill out of sabotaging her life and sort of watching the drama escalate. But yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I didn't want to make her trauma like a direct conduit to what she does later, because I don't like to insinuate that people who are traumatized will then go on to do those sorts of things. But I think all of our experiences, as hers did, do complicate the way that we move through the world. And in her case, it absolutely complicated the way that she moved through the world, especially the way that she saw men and saw her relationship with men. And unfortunately, she didn't really learn and grow from it. She sort of stayed in this trapped place. And it was hard for her to sort of find a new belief system up until the very end of the book, I believe.
Yeah. So speaking of her identity, she worked in a bookstore, which is really interesting because of, she wanted to write a book. And did you ever work in a bookstore?
I did. Yeah. That was like definitely an autobiographical detail that I stole from my own life, because I was definitely working in a bookstore up until the point where I started writing this book, and I loved it. And I loved like being really close to the industry that I loved, but not being a part of it in sort of the, I wasn't an editor. I didn't work in a publishing house, but I loved sort of being on the ground floor of like knowing what people were wanting to read, what people were talking about. And I also just loved it because I think at that time, and I consider myself an extrovert, I really liked talking to people. I loved chatting with customers at the register. I loved meeting people from all over the world. I worked at a bookstore that was very, like, in a very sort of touristy location. So there were a lot of international tourists, and I was just always so stimulated and always eavesdropping on the things that people were saying around me. So if you're around a writer, they're definitely eavesdropping on you. Kind of comes with the territory. But yeah, I thought, there was a part of me while I was there at that point in my life I was definitely feeling a bit aimless. And the bookstore was like a really wonderful place to sort of take stock of what I wanted and reminded me of why I loved books, of why I wanted to write books. I was surrounded by fantastic colleagues who were similar to me, like also striving writers, talented writers who just wanted to be close to the industry. And I just was so taken by that time in my life that I knew that I wanted to make Naomi a bookseller as well, and sort of give her those insights into the world of literature.
Did you borrow any of your experiences for the book? Like, while, something from the bookstore, did you actually like take and put in there?
There were quite a few anecdotes. I mean, I think some of them were more general or more vague. Like I definitely have a line in there about like working with international tourists to help them identify like certain coins, helping them navigate to the Brooklyn Bridge. Definitely had people that would call me and say, I'm looking for a book with the cover is red, the word girl in the title. And I was like, what do you want me to do with that? I'm sure you have the same thing at the library. Like
yes.
You come in and you have this idea of what they're looking for. And you're like, you got to give me more than that. Like,
but when you do get it, they're always like so shocked. They're like,
oh my gosh, right? It's such a triumphant moment if you do figure it out. But it's like, they're not giving you a lot to work with, and I can't blame them. But so yeah, I think there were a lot of moments. Similarly, there was a cafe across the street from the bookstore that I worked at. And every weekend when I would arrive, I had like a nice camaraderie with the barista, and he would always give me a free latte. And I think that happens with one of the characters in the book, but it was really lovely. I always sort of knew like, it was sort of the weekend workers. We all sort of were looking out for each other, and we're always showing up to the same place at the same time. And there's a camaraderie that happens when you're sort of commuting at the same time in the same area, dealing with the same people, because customers would frequently stream between the cafe and the bookstore. So we had the same customers essentially, which was interesting. Gave us some things to talk about.
Okay, so let's talk about Instagram as a stalking tool.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
I loved how it was used as like the main stalking tool. And I was thinking when I was reading it, it's just a shame that they got rid of that activity tab.
Oh my gosh, right? Or you could see what other people are liking. And yeah, that would have been, Naomi would have been really sad about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, imagine if they got rid of it like mid thing, she would have just lost it. Because I was like, you got to see what people liked, you got to see who people followed. She would have seen Rosemary followed some random person. She would have been like, who is this person? I gotta follow. She'd be following all the same people.
It's actually crazy. Like I almost forgot about that period in the Instagram life cycle. I mean, and I already think it's insane what we have access to on Instagram. And to think that we also had access to all of those things, like real time live updates into what, whoever we followed were following and liking, that is, unfathomable to me, even though it was absolutely a part of our reality for years. And I'm always interested in like what the conversations are at the top levels in these companies, like how they are planning to both preserve and exploit our privacy settings. Because I mean, that's a whole other conversation, but it is very interesting to me, like how we're all being manipulated by like a few people at the top, especially recently. There's the Instagram likes have sort of disappeared. You can make the like count disappear, which does like affect influencers who want to show that they have high engagement. But yeah, I mean, I really wanted to grapple with this in the book because I think it's just the way we live now. And I felt like if I didn't write about social media and I was writing a contemporary millennial story, it would feel false in some way. Like if they weren't on Instagram, there would have to be a real reason why they weren't. I would have to explain why they weren't. Whereas everyone I know, the only people that I know who are not on social media, they're like the dark horses, and they're the ones who are like, well, I'm not on it because it gives me anxiety, or I'm not on it because I'm wanting my privacy. Now the default is you assume everyone is online. And we all just I don't think anyone has real ideas of like who's watching us, who's keeping tabs on us at any given time, which is really creepy. And I wanted to sort of like lean into that creepy factor and like the things that we give other people access to about our own lives. Like we geotag, we do Instagram lives, like it's all crazy. And, I probably could have written about that for 50 more pages, just Instagram alone. But I had to eventually make things happen in the plot. But yeah, I'm really glad you picked up on that. And I'm glad that you were sort of interested in that aspect of it.
Well, it's funny because I can just imagine that she was probably thinking that who is this like person who has all these random pictures that like requests me and then watches every single one of my stories.
Yep.
And 2 seconds later, this person's watching my story. And like, I know as a person like who I use more stories than I do regular pictures, I look and see who, you know, like they don't even they don't like my regular pictures, but they have to watch every single one of my stories. And I'm like,
yeah,
thinking to myself, like, that's it. That was probably part of her thing. And she probably knew, you know, that this person was like, you know, watching every single one of her stories. And that's why I loved it as a stalking tool. I mean, as a plot, you know, not really as a stalking tool. I just loved it as that you used it as something like a main part of the story.
Yeah. And like, you know, given what you just said, it has been something that a lot of readers have been telling me is really relatable. Like everyone's either felt like they've been watched or have done the watching, because it, you know, there are ways to do it. Like sometimes it is innocuous. It's just like you find yourself going down a rabbit hole. Like you just see someone post about something and you're like, oh, that looks interesting. And then suddenly you're like 3 profiles deep and just have no idea what just happened. It's like you had a little blackout or something. And you're like, how did I get here? But I think it's something that absolutely everyone can relate to. And so that's been kind of fun to talk about with other people and just, you know, but also having these conversations where a lot of my readers are like, oh shit, I need to change my, my privacy settings. Because I had no idea. I mean, I talk about Venmo, or at least I talk about a version of Venmo where people can track your transactions, which is also crazy to me that, you know, we're allowing people to peek into our, you know, our financial lives. It's all very strange, like modern life. It's very strange, isn't it?
Yes, it's like that's one of the reasons I'm like Venmo is like private. I don't want anyone to know. I don't want anyone to know that I did like sushi dinner. It's like, you know, that's something exactly. Like that. And that works its way in there too. All right, back to Khalid. I think he was an interesting character. And do you think that they would have made it work if she wasn't so obsessive? Like, I think that, you know, there's a part of me that does believe that if she didn't sabotage it, they would have been a great couple.
Yeah, no, I think that like making that distinction, if she didn't sabotage it, they could have worked out. Like, I think they were 2 people who genuinely did care for each other and, you know, perhaps weren't like perfectly suited, but I think that they're both attracted to how different they were from one another. And I think ultimately this is sort of the tragedy of it for me, or this is how I was picturing Naomi's arc as I was writing it. I just felt like Naomi's fate in this book was to self-sabotage in whatever way possible. I think the book is one big mechanism for that. She's writing a book about the people in her life. What could go wrong? Everything. And I think she would have, if she wasn't writing a book, she would have found some other way to self-sabotage. She would have cheated. She would have, you know, said something horrible to him. She would have, you know, searched his bags. Like, I think that there was this element that's just this very deep, desperate part of her that just didn't feel good enough for him, didn't feel worthy. And that was sort of her own journey to figure out. And like, I want to believe that once the book ends, she's finally turning a new page in her life, not to use a too accurate pun, but, you know, I wanted to believe that she could grow and change and finally value herself in a way that would allow her to value her relationships with others instead of throwing them all under the bus. But yeah, I mean, I don't think in this reality they would have worked because she was so hell-bent on sabotaging it. But I think the tragedy of it is absolutely they could have, if that wasn't her sort of one hang up throughout the book that didn't kind of let her go. But yeah, I mean, I want to believe in some alternate reality that they could have made it work, but I don't think that was her fate in this book, at least.
One of the things I also loved is that they did rock climbing together, because that's not something that, you know, most people bond over. But I just love how she found a way to be like, yeah, you know, I lived in Connecticut. I live in Colorado, but I never did it, but I always wanted to do it. And let's do it together. And you can spot me. And what inspired you to use rock climbing? Because that's definitely a different, I guess it's good because, you know, you could pair up, but it's definitely different.
Yeah, so I am definitely guilty of writing about things that I'm obsessed with in my work. And at the time that I was writing, I had just started rock climbing myself. And a friend of mine in my MFA program was like a writer I admired. And also she rock climbed, and she was like, why don't you just come with me one day and just like see how it goes? And I was freaked out about it because I am someone who I love like new experiences when I feel like I'm not going to make a fool of myself. Like I love to travel. I love to like try new restaurants. Like I love new things. But when I believe that people are going to be watching me and judging me, I get very stressed out. And I think there was some part of me that went into that. I had such anxiety about that first day of rock climbing. And then I just felt so free and liberated while doing it, and realized that the community at these bouldering gyms were, you know, really supportive, really encouraging, which I hoped came through in the book that I wrote. And so I think I honestly was just like, I need Rosemary and Naomi to bond over something that is not books and is not just drinking together at a bar. I wanted to sort of put them into action. I wanted to give them something to do, an activity. And because I just happened to be obsessed with rock climbing at the time, I was like, why not? I'll just throw rock climbing in there. And it ended up working really well. And I think I sort of stumbled into certain metaphors about climbing that were somehow also relevant to their character arcs at the time. Like the idea that, you know, you have to like trust your body, allow yourself to fall. I enjoyed the analogies and the metaphors I sort of stumbled upon as I was writing about those scenes. But yeah, it was a lot of fun to write because I love climbing, and I would recommend it to everyone. It's a really wonderful way to sort of get out of your head and into your body, as Naomi says.
Okay, so I want to talk about the ending without ruining it.
Okay.
To me, the ending was perfect. Like, I just loved how it like wrapped up like that. It just was, you know, and I don't want to ruin it, but I kind of felt like Rosemary flipped the switch. I feel like she kind of like used Naomi's own stuff against her. I don't know, something like I just thought it was perfect, because I just feel like it was almost like revenge, but not, you know, like all of her tools that she was using the whole time, she just flipped it back on her. And I just want to say, I just thought it was perfect.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, because I know that my ending has been controversial, and like there have been people who have reacted very strongly negatively to it because maybe they wanted something different. They wanted a certain confrontation to happen in a way that I did not give them. But I was really adamant about ending it the way that I did. And I'm really glad that you loved it. And I know there are definitely people that also loved it. I think there's no sort of middle ground. People either like really don't like it or really love it. And I kind of love that, though. I love like a good, healthy debate. So I'm always happy to hear why someone didn't like it. But I'm like, well, too bad. That's what I wrote. But yeah, I absolutely, yeah, like you hit the nail on the head with her flipping the switch on her, with her using her strengths against her. And I always knew that it sort of had to end that way. I think it felt inevitable to me the whole time. Like, even though I did have to sort of sit with my thesis advisor at one point in my MFA and really brainstorm, but I think I always knew when I really, you know, like looked within, this just always felt right as an ending, because I think Naomi, her need for control drove everything she did. And this was a moment where she just absolutely had no control at all, to the point of like, not even no control, but was actually almost like the butt of her own joke, in a way that I had a great time writing. Because in a sense, like I really did want Naomi to have to look at herself, like confront herself, and understand how she's affected the people around her. But I also wanted to give Rosemary that sense of agency. And I was just as fond of Rosemary. Like, I'm fond of everyone in this book. I think I have to in order to write them, you know, I had to love my characters in order to also put them through a lot of hell. But I really, I wanted the two women to be sort of mirrors of each other at any given moment, and to sort of show that at the end of the day, they actually weren't very different at all and had similar aspirations, similar insecurities. And that was really important to me to show, which is why at the end, I wanted that twist that I hope readers will enjoy when they get there. And I don't want to spoil it either.
Well, thank you very much for talking to me about A Novel Obsession. I was very obsessed with it. And I hope that other people will enjoy it as much as I did, and as much as you probably enjoyed writing it. So thank you very much for talking to me. And
thank you for having me.
Yes.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.